When a mountain explodes, the morning news headlines, they always seem to use the exact same word.
Right, sudden.
Exactly, a sudden eruption, a sudden disaster. But if you talk to a volcanologist sitting in an observatory lab, it's almost never sudden.
No, absolutely not. They usually knew it was coming for months.
Yeah. And that brings us to what we're doing today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at this incredibly fascinating document today, and it's titled Series 3, What a DSL Can Learn from a Volcanologist.
And just quickly, if you aren't familiar with that acronym, a DSL is a designated safeguarding lead.
Right.
That is the specific person in a school or like a boarding setting who carries the ultimate responsibility for keeping students safe.
Right.
They manage the crises.
And honestly, it is a profoundly heavy job.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
And the source material we're exploring today, it takes something that feels, deeply human and highly emotional school safeguarding, and it views it entirely through the cold, objective lens of physical science.
Specifically, the science of how researchers predict volcanic eruptions, which is just such a wild comparison.
It sounds strange at first, yeah.
But the mission for our deep dive today is to explore how that physical science framework can, well, completely reframe how we manage human risk.
Safety, yeah.
Because I really want to tell you, the listener, right now, whether you are managing a corporate team or working with children, or you just want to understand how crises actually build up in your own life, this perspective, it shifts everything.
It really does change how you view everyday risks.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the bridge this text builds is that human crises look exactly the same as that mountain.
Yes.
A serious incident happens, right? A crisis hits, or a significant disclosure is made by a student, and the entire community goes, wow, that came out of nowhere.
Right, but to the untrained eye, yes, it came out of nowhere. We see a headline, and it feels abrupt because we simply haven't been paying attention to that specific patch of Earth.
We're looking the other way.
Exactly. But volcanologists, they are watching for very specific, really subtle signals long before magma ever breaches the surface.
What kind of signals are we talking about?
Well, they monitor tiny localized tremors. They track, trace gas emissions. They look for ground deformation.
Ground deformation, like the Earth actually moving.
Yeah, where the Earth literally bulges just a fraction of an inch due to the pressure building underneath. And they watch for microscopic rises in surface temperature.
I mean, individually, if you just catch one of those things on a random Tuesday, it seems completely benign, right?
You'd easily brush it off.
Just a little burp of gas or a tiny shake.
You would. But the key is that volcanologists don't view data in isolation. They look at the confluence of signals.
All the pieces together.
Right. And the exact same mechanism applies to the world of a DSL. A safeguarding crisis feels sudden to the public, but the systemic signals were actually already firing.
So what does a tremor look like in a school?
It might be a slight unexplained drop in a student's attendance,
Mm-hmm.
or, it could be a low-level concern raised by a gym teacher who notices a kid is unusually withdrawn.
Or a sudden shift in peer dynamics, maybe.
Exactly, like a student entirely dropping their usual friend group over the course of a single week.
It makes me think of a structural flaw, like a hairline fracture in a massive bridge strut.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Because if you look at one tiny crack, you just think, well, it's an old bridge, things crack. You don't immediately assume the bridge is going to collapse tomorrow.
No, of course not.
But if you have a crack, plus a rusted bolt, plus this weird swaying motion when heavy trucks drive over it, the mechanism of failure is already in motion.
Yes.
So it's like a boiling pot of water. It doesn't instantly boil over. You get those tiny bubbles at the bottom first. Those behavioral changes in a school are the tiny bubbles.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. One fracture might just be wear and tear, but a pattern of fractures indicates an impending structural failure. The text really drives home the idea that isolated concerns may seem minor, but patterns are never minor.
Wait, I need to push back on this underlying premise for a second.
Sure.
Because if we are talking about self-guarding children or managing a school environment, isn't the ultimate goal to have absolutely zero risk?
Well,
Shouldn't a school be perfectly safe rather than a place where we just sit around acknowledging the bridge has fractures? Like, how does a professional even cope with the psychological toll of just managing active danger all day?
it's a fair question, and it's completely natural to crave a zero-risk environment, especially when vulnerable people are involved. We want those spaces to be sterile of all danger.
Yeah, exactly.
But the text introduces a professional truth, and this is core insight 1 from the source, that fundamentally challenges that desire.
Okay, what does it say?
It points out that volcanologists don't spend their careers studying dormant, dead volcanoes where nothing is ever going to happen.
That makes sense.
They work alongside active systems. They operate in environments with ongoing, contained risk that inherently possesses the potential to escalate.
So the translation is that schools, by their very nature, are active volcanic systems.
They are. In any boarding or educational setting, you are dealing with hundreds or thousands of human beings.
All interacting.
Yes. They all bring their own complex lives, their own traumas, outside influences, and their own volatile emotions into that building every single day.
You can't just check that at the door.
Right. Risk is inherently present. You cannot sterilize human complexity. The crucial difference between a safe school and an unsafe school isn't the absence of risk. It is how that risk is managed and monitored.
Wow. That is a massive strategic shift. Safeguarding isn't about eliminating all risk, because the laws of human nature literally make that impossible.
Exactly.
It's about living alongside the risk safely.
And the text phrases this in a very stark way.
Yeah.
The presence of risk is not a failure. Unmanaged escalation is the failure. What's fascinating here is that when we do post-mortems on most safeguarding crises, they are almost never unpredictable lightning strikes out of a clear blue sky.
Right, they had the bubbles.
They are simply unacted on patterns. The data was there, the intervention was not.
Unacted on patterns. That really shifts the entire burden of responsibility from, like, bad luck to flawed monitoring.
Yes, it puts the onus back on the system.
Which naturally brings us to the logistics of this. If crises come from unacted on patterns, the obvious next step is figuring out how to actually track those patterns.
Right.
And crucially, knowing when to step in before the eruption actually happens.
So let's look back at how a volcanologist monitors an active site, bringing in core insights 4 and 5 from the text.
Okay, lay it out for us.
It is not a casual once-a-semester review. They don't just hike up the mountain when they remember to.
No, I imagine they have sensors everywhere.
Exactly. The monitoring is relentless, it's systematic, and it's entirely data-informed. They use seismometers, GPS receivers, satellite radar, and the data flows continuously.
So for a DSL, what does that translate to?
It necessitates ongoing vigilance. Safeguarding is a continuous living process. It requires regular review of cases, constantly updated files, and frictionless communication channels between staff members.
But just gathering data isn't the full picture, is it?
No, not at all.
Because if you just sit there logging every single tremor without doing anything, you're essentially just taking excellent notes on a disaster as it destroys the town below.
That is the vital pivot. Gathering data is useless without a framework for action.
Right.
Volcanologists define exact alert levels and strict evacuation thresholds.
Thresholds.
Yes, they decide in the calm of the laboratory long before anything happens. If the tremors reach this specific frequency and the surface temperature rises by 3 degrees, we trigger a mandatory evacuation.
So there's no guessing in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. The threshold dictates the action.
So translating that for you, the listener, if you are building a safeguarding system or honestly any risk management system in a business or an organization, you have to define your thresholds ahead of time.
You have to.
Staff need to know the exact criteria for escalating a concern. They need to know when a conversation is enough, when an internal intervention is required, and when a hard line is crossed that requires bringing in external agencies.
Like Child Protective Services or law enforcement, yeah. Without those predefined thresholds, human nature takes over.
And what does human nature do?
Well, human nature in ambiguous situations is to hesitate.
Why do we hesitate so much, though? If a teacher sees something worrying, why wouldn't they just report it immediately?
Because of the psychological weight of the intervention, teachers really care about their students.
Yeah, of course they do.
They don't want to ruin a kid's permanent record. They worry about offending the parents or causing unnecessary panic.
They second-guess themselves?
Exactly. They think, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe they're just having a bad week. Ambiguity breeds paralysis.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's the difference between looking out your living room window, noticing the rain, and thinking, wow, it's getting pretty flooded out there. I wonder if we should start packing.
Right.
Versus having a strict, predetermined community rule that says, if the river gauge hits exactly 10 feet, we sound the sirens and initiate an evacuation.
That river gauge analogy is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
The mathematical threshold removes the subjective guilt.
It takes the pressure off the individual.
Yes. It removes the burden of the individual teacher having to make a massive, life-altering judgment call entirely on their own. The system gives them the permission and, more importantly, the mandate to act.
It says, you don't have to decide if this is a crisis.
You just have to report that the water hit 10 feet.
Yeah.
The system will handle the rest.
It completely depersonalizes the escalation process.
It does.
But wait, even with all this math and all these strict thresholds, a volcanologist still can't tell you that a mountain is going to explode on Tuesday at 4:00 p.m., can they?
They cannot. And the source text is very clear on synthesizing this reality. Which brings us to core insight 6.
Okay.
Even with continuous monitoring and clear thresholds, the exact timing of an event remains elusive. Outcomes will still vary. The goal is not perfect prediction.
That feels a bit counterintuitive. If we aren't trying to predict the exact moment, what are we doing?
The goal is preparedness. A safeguarding team will never be able to predict every single incident that will ever happen in a school hallway.
Obviously not. Yeah.
But they can intensely prepare for the patterns of escalation. Prepared systems drastically reduce the impact of an event, even if they can't predict the exact minute it happens. Preparedness saves lives. An obsession with perfect prediction just creates blind spots.
It's the concept of boarding up the windows. You don't need to know the exact minute the hurricane makes landfall to know that putting plywood over the glass is a smart move.
Exactly.
But as much as this physical science framework clarifies things, we do have to look at where the metaphor hits a wall.
Oh, absolutely. It does break down.
The text actually includes a section called the honest bit, which points out a fundamental limitation. A volcano is ultimately just a massive pile of rocks and magma.
Right.
A school is entirely composed of complex, emotional people.
It is a massive distinction. Geology is bound by the rigid laws of physics. Human behavior is vastly more chaotic.
Way more unpredictable.
Exactly. And the text lays out a critical difference chart to explore this. Think about the physical proximity and the level of control.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, a volcanologist observes a natural system from a safe distance. They sit in a lab looking at monitors. They have absolutely zero control over the magma chamber itself.
They can't just tell the volcano to calm down.
No, they can't cool the lava down or ask the tectonic plates to stop shifting. They just observe and predict.
Right, but a DSL doesn't have the luxury of distance.
Mm-hmm.
They are managing a human system. They are actively in the building, and they are required to intervene.
Yes, exactly.
They hold an active, legal, and moral responsibility to change the outcome.
That is the core limitation of the metaphor. Safeguarding is active. It is not purely observational. If a volcanologist sees an eruption coming, they get people out of the way, and then they let the mountain explode.
But the DSL cannot let the mountain explode.
No. If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a DSL sees the behavioral thresholds being met, intervention is mandatory. You cannot just document the disaster as it ruins a child's life.
You have to step into the path of the escalation.
You have to alter the trajectory.
And there's another layer to this human element, too. A volcano has no idea it is being monitored.
Right.
It doesn't act differently because a satellite is pointed at it. But a teenager absolutely knows when adults are watching them.
Yes, human systems demand something very different from us. Humans interact with their environment and they react to interventions.
They might hide things.
Exactly. A student might mask their distress, they might manipulate the adults around them, or they might act out in highly unpredictable ways precisely because they feel the system closing in on them.
So to handle this chaotic, unpredictable human element, the text outlines how a leader builds what it calls a pattern-aware safeguarding culture.
Yes, the 3 tiers.
Let's ground this in reality, because this is where the theory actually hits the road. Let's introduce a hypothetical scenario to trace how this works in practice. Let's say we have a high school student. We'll call him Marcus.
Okay, let's look at Marcus.
Marcus is normally a pretty engaged kid, but over the course of 3 weeks, a few things happen. On Monday, he drops out of the basketball team without giving the coach a reason.
Okay, that's one signal.
Then on Wednesday, the chemistry teacher notices he's sleeping through the lab. And on Friday, the lunch monitor sees him sitting entirely alone instead of with his usual friends.
Right.
In a standard reactive school, what happens to Marcus?
Well, in a reactive school, those 3 events stay isolated. The basketball coach assumes Marcus just lost interest in sports.
The chemistry teacher probably gets annoyed.
Yeah, assumes Marcus is staying up too late playing video games, maybe gives him detention, and the lunch monitor doesn't think much of it because, teenagers are moody.
So none of those adults talk to each other.
None of them. The data points remain completely siloed. So a month later, when Marcus has a severe mental health crisis or gets involved in a serious altercation, the school administration is shocked. They say, It was so sudden.
Because nobody connected the hairline fractures.
Exactly.
So how does a pattern-aware school handle Marcus differently? The text breaks this down into 3 foundational tiers. Let's explore how they actually function.
The first tier is foundations, which focuses on safety and care. This is the continuous monitoring and clear structures.
So the baseline data collection.
Right. In our scenario, this means having an actual frictionless system in place where the coach, the teacher, and the lunch monitor can quickly log what they saw.
It is the equivalent of making sure your seismographs are actually plugged in and networking with each other.
Yes. If there is no central database or regular staff briefing to collect the dots, you can't possibly connect them.
Okay, I'll take the second tier, because this is where the human element really shines. The text calls it developmental pathways.
Right.
But the core mechanism inside it is well-being literacy. This means that having the software to log concerns isn't enough. The staff needs the vocabulary to understand what the data actually means.
Exactly. How does that play out for Marcus?
Well, with high well-being literacy, the chemistry teacher doesn't just look at a sleeping student and think, lazy kid.
We see the signal.
Right, they recognize the sudden change in baseline behavior as a potential tremor. They speak the same language of risk as the DSL.
Ensuring staff recognize escalation pattern.
Exactly. They understand that dropping a beloved sport, extreme fatigue, and social isolation are classic documented signs of an escalating crisis. The whole staff is trained to see the mechanisms of distress, not just the annoying symptoms.
That shared literacy is incredibly powerful because it feeds directly into the third tier, leadership.
And what does that focus on?
Preventative safeguarding. This is where the DSL takes the structural data from the foundations, applies the nuanced understanding from the well-being literacy, and executes a proactive intervention. It's data-informed decisions.
So instead of waiting for the explosion, what does the leadership actually do?
They step in before the threshold is breached. Because the system flagged Marcus's pattern early, the DSL pulls the chemistry teacher, the coach, and the school counselor into a room.
They look at the full picture.
Right. They don't wait for Marcus to fail all his classes or get into a fight. They initiate a supportive conversation with him that week.
They check in with his parents.
Yes. They alter the environment to relieve the pressure before the magma reaches the surface. They take active responsibility for the outcome.
And that is the absolute crux of it. To bring this all together for you listening, the volcanologist is never surprised by the eruption.
Never.
They aren't shocked when the mountain finally blows because they have been watching the whole time. They have noticed the tiny signals, they have tracked the long-term patterns across multiple instruments, and they have intimately understood the buildup.
And safeguarding demands that exact same discipline.
It does. It cannot afford to be reactive. It must be alert, informed, mathematically sound, and ready to act.
Because for those who are truly paying attention, the signs were always there.
So what does this all mean for us? How do we take this hardcore physical science framework and apply it to our very human, very messy lives today?
This raises an important question, and it is actually the exact question the text leaves us with to carry forward into our own professions.
What is it?
What specific safeguarding signals are currently present in your setting that might indicate escalation if we do not act right now?
Oh, that's good.
What are the tiny behavioral tremors, the slight shifts in performance, the low-level concerns that you might be brushing off as isolated events, but which are actually forming a dangerous structural pattern?
That is the question to sit with this week. Whether you are walking the halls of a school, running a corporate division, or just observing the dynamics inside your own family.
Absolutely.
And I'll leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. As if we accept the reality that we are always living alongside active risk and that these small bubbly signals are constantly surfacing.
Which they are.
At what point does our desire to wait for just one more piece of data actually become the very hesitation that prevents us from stopping the eruption?
Wow. Yeah.
You don't need a sudden explosion to know a mountain is active. You just have to be brave enough to look at the tremors and act on them. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.